Hi, I'm Jim McCann, founder of 1-800-Flowers. We created this podcast to share the wonderful people we get to interact with, we get to meet, we get to know, and most importantly, get to learn from. So I invite you to join us on this journey here on the Celebrations Chatter podcast. I'm here today with a friend, Dan Willingham, Dr. Dan Willingham, who has got a terrific new book out called Outsmart Your Brain. And I have it right here. It's been a treat to get to go through in the last day or so. But Dr. Dan is an amazingly accomplished guy. He's got his BA at Duke. He got his PhD in cognitive psychology at a little school up in Cambridge called Harvard. And he's been a professor at the University of Virginia teaching psychology since 1992. I thought you were born in 1992, Dan.
You flatter me, Jim.
And I've gotten to know Dan. Dan's one of those COVID buddies.
Yeah,
we've never met in person, but we've gotten to know one another, and I certainly like and respect him a great deal. And Dan, you've been doing the work in cognitive psychology and the methods of learning for a long time. You were a bit of a lab rat originally, and now teaching for a long time. It's such a good book, and Lisa, who's my producer, who you know, she and I were chatting just this morning saying, geez, I wish we'd been able to get the book earlier because we would have liked to have finished it ourselves. But each of us said, I can't wait this weekend to really dive into it because there's so much in here about learning. So let me start with some naive questions here. What body of work caused you to say, I have another book in me and it's going to be about outsmarting your brain?
yeah. Jim, as you mentioned, I started my life as a lab rat, as you described. So I was doing basic research in human memory. So basically, I sort of joke about it in the introduction to the book that it's an old joke among academics that when you tell your parents you're getting a PhD, they tell all their friends, my child is a doctor, but not the type who helps anybody. And that was
or makes money.
Or makes money. That was very, very much true of me. So I was a learning researcher who couldn't help you learn anything really. I was doing very technical work, sort of at the intersection of neuroscience and cognitive psychology. And that was like the first 10, 15 years post PhD, I was doing that. And then sort of out of the blue, I got invited to address a conference of teachers. And I said to the person who invited me, like, look, I don't know anything about education, really.
I remember reading that, and you almost backed out of the speaking gig.
I wanted to, because well, the truth is that initially, I got an ego like anybody else, Jim. I was kind of flattered. I'm like, sure, I'd love to talk to a bunch of teachers. And then like right before I had to give the talk, like 6 months later, and I was getting ready to write this talk, I realized that what in the world am I going to tell teachers about learning that they don't already know? So I literally just sort of picked some slides out of the course that I had been teaching undergraduates at UVA for a number of years, of things that I thought they possibly would find interesting. And much to my surprise, they did find it very interesting. They didn't already know it. And that is how I sort of embarked on this second career of drawing from what cognitive psychologists know about learning and attention to classroom applications. And I have written for teachers before, but I had never written for students before.
Yes.
And especially in the last 5 years or so, there were more and more surveys, both of students and teachers, showing that teachers don't know and therefore weren't teaching students about how they can study themselves, sort of teach themselves, self-regulate their own learning. And because teachers don't know it and aren't teaching it to students, students don't know it. And so I thought that's something that I can maybe address.
Well, let's jump right into that, Dan, because back to Lisa and my assistant, Patty, who you know quite well over the phone too. We have this conversation pretty regularly, and that's what Lisa and I were chatting about earlier this morning. Well, how do you do this? Is there a better way to do that? And we were talking about the different kinds of learners that we are.
Mhm.
And I said, it took me a long time, probably didn't realize during school that I was an audio learner,
Mhm.
that if I heard it, it was better than if I read it. And is there any science to that? Are people different kind of learners?
The type of distinction that you're drawing is one of the most widely believed facts about learning, but that's actually not a fact. So there have been
Go ahead,
surveys.
ruin it for me. Go ahead, Dan.
Okay, let me ruin your morning for you.
Well, for example, if I want to remember a phone number, if I see it
Yes.
on a piece of paper, or if I say it out loud, it seems to me, I go ahead and shatter it for me. I know.
Okay.
It seems to me that I have a much better prospect of remembering it if I've said it out loud.
So, and that may well be true. So but the thing to keep in mind is that what's probably at work there is not you as a learner, but the material that you're trying to remember. So you want to match how you're thinking about content, how you're trying to remember content with the nature of the content. So to just give a really extreme example, if I'm a teacher doing a geography lesson and I'm trying to help children learn the map of Europe, this obviously needs to be a visual presentation. If I've got an auditory learner in my classroom, it's not going to do any good to say, well, I'm not going to show you the map. I'm going to describe these to you auditorily. So that's an extreme example, but that's generally what researchers find is there's a big benefit to changing how you teach things depending on the content. But there's not consistency within a learner, sort of like a learning style that they carry with them from task to task that researchers can find.
Well, here we're talking about education and a long, long history of education. It seems to me, being an old guy, that it really hasn't changed much in my lifetime. Yet your last book, Why Don't Students Like School, really did provide a great deal of intersection of science and real world learning to understand why kids were struggling in school. And yet I don't see a lot's changed, Dan.
They're not listening to me, Jim. What can I say? No, more seriously, I think that it is true. There are aspects in which learning schools seem to stay the same. So you've got the teacher at the front, you've got the students sitting in rows, listening to the teacher. But there are other, I think, more subtle ways in which education does change over time. So the nature of the curriculum does change. One thing that's been pointed out, and you can think of this as positive or negative, but when you and I were kids, I think today, a lot of times people say, why don't they teach you to do your taxes in school? How come you could never learn how to sew on a button or cook a meal? All this practical life stuff. And I don't know about you, but like when I was a kid, we actually learned all that stuff in school. And it is true that it's much less common today. And today there's more sensibility that these are things that children should learn at home, and at school, we're going to teach the things you can only learn at school. So I think there's change around the edges is what I'm saying. But on the whole, I agree with you. Big picture change. This is a very conservative institution, American schooling.
No, so we're talking about learning, we're talking about teaching, but we're all talking about this physical thing that is our brain. Yeah. And I was shocked to read that the size of our brain. Did you, in the book, did I see that you said that there are 1 billion cells in our brains?
Yeah, hundreds of billions. Yeah, and more connections. Yeah, it's absolutely wild. And the brain weighs about 3 pounds. The other thing that I find the strangest sort of physical fact, thinking about the physicality of our brain, the consistency of your brain is it's sort of like oatmeal. It's kind of mushy. It's suspended in this liquid and cerebrospinal fluid. And so that's why it doesn't collapse on itself. But yeah, the consistency is kind of gooey.
I'm particularly sensitive to this question, Dr. Dan, which is, I'm old, and yet I'm still trying to learn. We're told, we see older people around us saying, oh, I'm done learning. I'm too old for that. But I remember, I think it was Justice Stevens, who served on the Supreme Court well into his 90s. I think he died at 99. And he was, one of his clerks came in and he was sitting in the window well of his office. And the clerk asked him, "What are you doing, Mr. Justice?" And he said, "I'm teaching myself to read the Greek philosophers in the original Greek language."
Wow.
And the clerk said to himself and to his friends later, 92 years old, and he's still on a quest to learn new things. Talk to us about aging and learning, and should we be shutting down, saying it's too late for us, wheel me off to the edge of the cliff, or can this muscle still learn, and can we still influence its physicality and therefore its capability?
Absolutely, you can continue to learn. Now, there are aging effects. So aside from, we'll start with the less than great news.
Don't hurt me again here with more.
Yeah, no, I'm not. It's mostly happy news. So, aside from the fact that there are neural diseases that are associated with aging, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, aside from that, just with healthy aging, there are changes to our brain, and we do lose some of our edge. So an important distinction is between the speed and agility with which you can juggle what you know, and then the sheer volume of how much stuff that you know. And when we think about thinking, both of those are important. The facility with how much stuff you can keep in mind at once, and how agile you are at manipulating and making comparisons, that matters. But then the amount of stuff you've got in the storage bank matters too.
Can you hit full?
No, you can't hit full. You can always be learning more.
Really?
And
will the brain's capacity, is it unlimited to the best of our knowledge?
Yes.
We all heard that Einstein used 15% of our brain, the rest of us use 3%. Are we maxing out its capacity at some point, either in terms of memory or in terms of ability to learn?
Neither one. You definitely do not. Yeah, you definitely do not run out of space. The 10% of, you're only using 10% of your brain is another myth. So everybody who's listening should know that as well. And you can, when you think about it, that sort of factoid doesn't really pass the sniff test. There's never anybody who had a catastrophic injury to the head who didn't have some consequences of that. Like, oh, good, you didn't hit the 10% that you're using. It's went into that other 90%, so you're fine.
Maybe it's just a way of reflecting the fact that there's so much more we can do with our brain.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, if you think about it in terms of potential, all of us can sort of think that way and really benefit. I think there is more that I could be doing. Mm-hmm. But back to aging for a minute. So I distinguish between these two sort of properties of the brain, sort of how quickly and agilely you can juggle information, and how much you know. Young people are more agile, and your ability to keep information in mind and manipulate it quickly actually starts to your pinnacle is in your early 20s,
which coincides with our physicality.
Yeah, exactly. And it's with every decade it's dropping measurably.
Can we do anything about that?
Athletes, yes.
I'm a baseball fan. There's some scientific information that measures physical performance, and with a baseball player, it really does start to deteriorate around 24 years old. That doesn't mean the players don't get better. They do, because of their training, because of their learning, and because of their experience. They can still improve, even though their underlying physical abilities have started to deteriorate in a measurable way. Is it true for the brain too?
I did not know that those data that you describe on baseball players, and that's fascinating. It's a beautiful parallel to what's happening mentally, because it's just the same. It's like, yeah, you're that kind. If you think of that as raw ability, that's declining, but just as baseball players are drawing on experience and skill, in the same way we are drawing on what we know, so that our ability to think is actually improving. And the other thing is that you were sort of asking, can you delay the loss of that agility, that side of the equation? And the answer is most researchers think that you can, and that it really comes from practice. And the hypothesis is that a lot of this is about blood flow. If you and so regular physical exercise is also helpful. So if you've got vascular heart health, you're getting better blood flow to the brain, and that is not only helping thought sort of in the moment, but it's also helping flush away waste products during sleep more efficiently.
Okay, and I see two new books here.
Right.
One is The Brain and Aging.
Yeah.
And that the connection to the physicality is sort of obvious, but when you said it, it was like, wow. And then the other piece is, what role does sleep play in our brain function? And I was with a high school buddy who's a psychologist as well, and he was telling me, it's trying to explain to me that he said sleep is basically like the exhaust output of your brain's activity throughout the day. It needs to run wild and clean up and organize and discard a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, that's a nice analogy. Absolutely.
It sounds to me like a balanced lifestyle, especially as we age, is critically important, not only for our physical health, but for our mental health. And they're directly related because it's about blood flow. What benefits are there to forcing ourselves into a learning modality at any age? What does forcing yourself to learn new things, to take in new ideas, not just as a passive viewer, but as an active participant to learn like you would in school? What positive impacts does that have on your brain's health? Would it be your neuroplasticity?
I mean, I would describe the benefits really in psychological terms. In a way, like if you tell me, oh, your brain isn't changing, but you're learning, I would be fine with that, right? So like brain change is not really my goal. It's more the psychological change that I care about. And, that's predictable because I'm a psychologist. But I think there's so many benefits to new learning. I mean, one most obvious is sort of self-perception and continuing to feel vital and continuing to feel engaged and not feeling like, in some way my best days are behind me, and that from here on my life has a certain predictability.
You're in a glide path in a bad direction.
Exactly. Yeah. Losing altitude. And then in very practical terms, there's, good research on creativity that if creativity is any part of what you do, either for work or for pleasure, broad knowledge is really important for creativity. And that's one of the reasons why it's important, even if you feel like I'm really have largely mastered what I do at work, and that's going really well. I don't know exactly where I would turn to learn new things that seem directly related to what I do. Mm-hmm. You should spread out a little bit and start learning about things that maybe don't immediately, in an obvious way, have a lot to do with your work life, and you may discover they do.
And the construct there is you never run out of capacity, and the more you learn, the more you can learn.
Absolutely.
I think that's the underlying reason to read your book here, because it's never too late, and there's always benefits to come from the exercises you teach here. And I love the way you laid out the book in terms of each chapter, a different theme, and practical takeaways in each chapter. You talked about the importance of sleep and quality sleep. What roles do fatigue and distraction? So when I'm in a car and I need to pay attention, I turn the radio down.
One's intuitions about the ways in which distraction harms cognition are 100% on. You really can't think about two things at once. You can shift attention, but you really can't multitask. There's been a lot of research on that in the last 20 years.
And I've heard you talk about that before, and you really blew my mind. Yeah, because I thought I could multitask.
Everybody feels like
I can.
Yeah. Everybody feels like they can, for sure. But what you're really doing is switching, and there really is a switching cost. And the same thing is true, when you're at the office, when you're interrupted. If you allow yourself to be interrupted, that is switching attention. And there's a cost to coming back and sort of getting back into the swing of whatever you were doing. So there's lots of things you can do to try and avoid distraction. One is, I mean, this is why we tell students, like, find a quiet place to work, right? Like, change your environment so that the distractions just aren't there in the first place. That's much easier than trying to ignore them. So in other words, having your phone there and then saying, well, I'm just going to ignore it. Like, if I get a text message, I just won't read it. That's not a recipe for success. You really just, I mean, and there are actually studies showing in driving simulators where the researchers say, let us have your phone number. We're going to ping you with some text messages. Now, we don't want you to answer when we ping you, okay? But you should know that's going to happen. And so then because they're in a driving simulator, they're able to measure in great detail the skill of the driving. And what they find is people who are used to answering their phones when they're in the car, when the message goes on, even if they ignore it, there's still a cost. People are going up on the sidewalk and, just not driving well. So yeah, that's the first and most important thing, is to choose your place wisely. And if you're in a situation where you can't choose your place, you can still try to change it. So a student may be like, the only place they can work is at the kitchen table, and their siblings are coming in, and it's the kitchen, right? But so they can do things like try and situate their chair so that every time the little brother comes in to the fridge, they're not distracted by seeing him. They can use foam earplugs so that they're not getting that sort of auditory distraction. So there are things you can do about it, but you need to be thoughtful and plan.
Now I'm thinking the Irish guilt factor that I deal with. If I sit down with my wife to watch TV, there was a serial TV program we used to watch, and we used to watch it on Sunday night. But my wife has noted that I feel guilty if I sit down and watch TV. So I always have something on my lap, some work, some emails I'm doing. And so she says, the nice thing about you thinking you can do two things at once is you can watch that same episode 3 times because you never watched it. She says, I actually watch it, so I'm annoyed that I have to watch it again with you. So I think that just makes your point that you think you're multitasking, but you're just switching.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Now, the next thing in the news that everyone's chatting about is Chat GPT.
Oh, yes.
People are concerned about the impact this could have on education. I think it's exciting. I think it could change so many things, but I think it'll have a little bit of a crypto arc to it. That is crypto, everything. And then some bad guys do some things. Crypto's not worth the time.
Right.
But clearly it is. Clearly blockchain is going to matter. And I think we'll see a little bit of the same phenomenon with these large language-based learning systems. What impact do you think will artificial intelligence have on teaching, learning, and how we interact with devices?
I think in the near term, the thing that everybody in education is really focused on is the possibility that students are going to use this in ways that they're not supposed to use it. That's in the education press. That's about 90% of the discussion that I'm seeing. And I think that's something that teachers are going to have to think about and be aware of. It's not that different than the situation that math teachers have faced for a few decades now, that when you assign math homework, students can go home and find resources on the internet that allow them to solve homework problems and so on. So, there's going to need to be some thoughtfulness about that. But it doesn't seem like that big a deal. In terms of the broader implications of what AI might mean for education, it's a little hard to predict, but I mean, there are 2 things I'll say about it. One is that the promise is that you can get much better adaptability student by student for computer-based learning. So this has long been a dream of, and the main promise of computer-based education is that every student in a class, 25 students sitting there, can be working on different things, that the computer algorithm will be tuned to individual student performance. And so, the teacher doesn't have to just pitch to the middle, leaving some kids behind and boring some other kids. That's always been the promise, but it's been incredibly difficult to pull off. And I think AI has a lot of promise, not only in terms of sort of finding that sweet spot for each student, but even more being able to, on the fly, interpret what students know to calibrate the materials that students are going to be exposed to. Now, that's the promise, but one of the things I think we really learned over COVID is the importance of the student-teacher human connection. And that obviously ChatGPT is missing, and is not going to add anything to that dimension. And so we're going to need to be thoughtful about how any sort of new AI-based program gets implemented, and be mindful of the fact that it's not going to have that human interpersonal quality.
That's been the dream for educators forever, no matter what their class size, is to be able to pull up those who are struggling and yet push those who are at the top end of the performance in that particular subject and make sure they stay challenged, so they're not just speaking to the middle. And that's what educators have been doing there since the beginning of formal education.
Exactly. And I mean, it's an incredible challenge. Just think of, 25 students in front of you, two problems. One is knowing where they all are, which seems challenging enough. And then once you know it, doing something about it. It's really beyond the capacity of any one person. And so that's been the chief great hope of computer-based instruction.
We put our heart into everything we do. We are farmers, bakers, florists, and makers who grow and create with a passion. Made with love at every step of the way. Because at the end of the day, we know you're sending more than a gift. 1-800-Flowers, share with love.
What will we be saying a few years from now about the whole COVID experience? What did we learn from it? What were the implications of remote learning en masse like we had to experience? And are there any positives? Does it shape the role of e-learning in our development in our educational systems?
I think it has shaped how people think about e-learning. Because I feel like the big lesson everybody learned, obviously what you see in the press is the chief conclusion, and I think it's right, which is a lot of kids did not learn very much. This is not a reason to necessarily be down on e-learning, because you've got to remember this was an emergency. Nobody really got any training in this, and they were sort of on the fly. I mean, I had 3 days. I was told, in 3 days, you have to be back online and teaching. And I'm, of course, teaching students who are very well self-regulated and can, bring a lot to the table in terms of teaching themselves. I'm not teaching first graders, right? But with all of that said, we also learned how important that human connection is, and that being on Zoom is just not the same. And that is, it remains to be fully described what people get out of that human interaction. But all of us felt it in Zoom fatigue, right? I mean, I think the straightforward interpretation of why it's exhausting to be on Zoom for long periods of time is that you are missing social cues that are on Zoom that are present when you're live. And so your focused attention trying to extract everything you can out of this sort of impoverished social signal.
Which is fatiguing.
And then you end up fatigued. Yeah. And so kids clearly felt that too. But of course, what children mostly did was they just, they stopped trying because it was just too hard.
It's estimated that in just 5 years' time, that the e-learning industry will be a $300+ billion category. And I wonder if COVID has accelerated that and contributed to that enormous market opportunity. Sebastian Thune, teaching a virtual class, he says normally he'd have 25 students in his class at Stanford learning about physics, but now he was doing classes on a global basis, and he had students from Asia and Africa and South America and Europe, the best of the best, and he had 4,000 in his class now. So the access to learning opportunities has got to be greater in an e-learning environment. But I would suspect, like everything, absolutism is the enemy here. Perfect education in a classroom, one-on-one, is diluted by the second student, the third student. What's the perfect class size? What's the best for social interaction, the social cues? And then e-learning at the other extreme, I would suspect that it can be at the very least supplemental. As a researcher about learning and education, what kinds of things about e-learning do you think are exciting? And
I think supplemental is a good way to think about it. And you've identified one, I think, very important benefit, which is access for people who would not otherwise have access. I mean, that part of the story really was the early 2010s when MOOCs started, these massive online courses. And yeah, there is like people with an internet connection, but were in very remote areas, would not have access to education, got it for the first time. But, you know, the completion rate on MOOCs was something like 2%. So it was, it was very, very low. So it was very exciting for a small subset of people. But it was not but the way people were talking in the early 2010s is like, why would you take Introduction to Cognitive Psychology with Dan Willingham? Like, everybody in the country should be taking it from the same, whoever the best person is in the country to teach that course, everyone will be taking it from that person. Mm-hmm. There are other ways in which I think e-learning is helpful. It's terrific for kids who have really had a hard time socially to take a year off and be able to get out of that environment, kids who are really under extreme bullying. It's also great in smaller middle schools and high schools. If a kid wants to take Russian or something, right, then they can access that course. But I think supplemental is the word you use is exactly the right way to think about it, that you don't want to think of this as a comprehensive education solution because it does have these limitations we've been talking about.
You're right. I mean, the perfect situation is to be in a classroom with a wonderful professor and the best professor on that subject, and the best professor on that subject, to the points you make in your book, Outsmart Your Brain, would also likely be quite a good performer, because it's not just knowing the subject, it's being able to bring it alive and appeal to different people at different moments with different perceptions. That's the art and beauty of great educators. I agree.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is you definitely need to be part performer, and you know that being a good performer is connecting with your audience, right, and having that human connection.
I'm a note taker. Yeah. If I'm listening, like now, I'm taking notes on some of the unbelievable things you're telling us here, and that's how I learn. It teaches. I've learned that I learn best when I'm listening, I'm engaged like I am with you, and I'm taking notes on the things you say. Even if I never come back to it, it seems to me that the process of writing it and thinking about what I'll write is causing me to think and learn differently. Is that also a myth?
No, that is not a myth. That is 100% right. That just the process, just as you say, the process of taking notes sort of helps cement what you're thinking into your mind. And even if you never revisit the notes, you will remember what's happened better. There's lots of research showing that that's the case. The second function of notes that people usually think of is also true, which is that notes will serve later as a reminder of what you were thinking about at the time. And that's true as well.
And I remember when I was in a classroom, if I took notes and I was really engaged in the process, again, of what I write down, and I have a system I've developed of indicating what's the real priority here and what do I need to come back to later. So I have my little code, and
Oh,
and
nice.
hieroglyphics here of sorts. So when I come back to look at those notes, I know what I need to focus on, what I need to go back to. That would seem to me to be the most important. Because when we're listening to,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
to a teacher,
Yeah.
we're trying to guess and game her or him in terms of what's going to be on the exam.
Right, right.
So they're going to give you a tell that this is really important.
So yeah, and some instructors will do that. You know, you better write this down.
Yeah.
And I never saw any reason to be mysterious about it. I want my students to know what are the most important ideas, right? Obviously. But I was going to ask Jim, do you mind sharing like one or two of your hieroglyphics? Just
Well, yes, I circle things that I think are particularly important.
yeah.
I put a line through it if I've already gone through it and back. I use a check mark in the left-hand margin if it's something I need to come back to, a to-do of
Nice.
sorts.
Yeah.
I use a straight line if it's something I have to do, or if it's already done, it's a check.
Nice. Oh yeah,
So,
that's
and-
great. So this is a suggestion I make in the book. It's exactly that, you know, you make little notations to yourself that are sort of comments on your notes.
Yes.
You know, a comment corresponding to, I need to come back to this because I'm writing it down, but I don't think I really understand it, for example.
There was a wonderful fellow by the name of Dr. Stephen Covey. He wrote one of the best-selling books of all time called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And I had an opportunity to speak with his daughter, Cynthia Covey-Haller, who wrote a book called Living Life in Crescendo, which spoke to me because as we get to the end of life, we have two choices. We can live it in innuendo, or you can live it in crescendo, where you're always trying to do more, reach more, have more, do more, learn more. And I choose the latter, crescendo. But I remember taking a lecture class from Dr. Covey many, many years ago. And he divided the class in half. It was quite a large audience. And one audience, he said, I'm going to go through this lecture and you are going to be, some of you I'm going to call on, and you're going to be asked to re-give the lecture. And the other half of the audience, he told them, you're just here to listen and learn. No extra requirement.
Yeah.
Well, the retention and the genuine learning, as you would well guess, of the group that was told that they were going to have to re-give that lecture, they listened different, they took notes differently,
Yeah.
they had higher levels of motivation, including avoidance of embarrassment and wanting to do well and challenge. So how do we harness that? How do you encourage people to harness that in their daily learning activities?
That's a wonderful story, and you know it is a little bit of a technique that will probably only work once, right? But on the other hand, you actually, I don't know that I would definitely recommend this, but you can do something similar as an instructor that I have done, which is in some of my classes, I'll tell students, so there are readings, and every class, somebody is randomly selected and they have to come up and give a 1-minute sort of rundown of one of the readings. And you never know if it's going to be you. So you always need to be prepared in that
on your
way.
game.
On your game, and, you know, really have done it carefully enough. The other thing you can do that's a little more realistic, and this is something that you can apply to yourself, not something a teacher would do, is when you're trying to be sure that you really understand an idea, you can imagine teaching it to someone else. And especially imagine teaching it when you don't have the content right in front of you, when you're really working from memory. When we imagine teaching it, when we actually, and I would actually recommend not just imagining, but talking out loud. So talking out loud and to an imaginary person you're teaching does a couple of things. One is when you talk out loud, you really have to articulate your ideas. A lot of times when we're trying to determine whether or not we know something, if you try and access the information in memory and there's something in there, you kind of think like, okay, yeah, I got that. You don't take the time to really be sure that the information is really complete. And so you overestimate what you know. Something that is just tenuously in memory, you end up evaluating it as, yes, I really know that. The other thing is that by imagining that you're teaching someone else, you're being more demanding of the explanation that you would give. Because when we teach someone else, we know we have to be very complete in our explanation. It needs to be sequenced in a way that's logical because this person doesn't know anything. And so we've got to give a really clear explanation for them.
You know, mutual friend, Dr. George Everly over at Johns Hopkins, he was accused by a friend of his, who's a psychiatrist friend of his. He says, when George wants to learn something, he doesn't just learn about it, he intends to write a book about it. So it's the same kind of idea in that when George gets into a new subject that piqued his interest, he goes about learning it like he's going to teach it in a book to others. So It sounds like we're on the same vein there. And people who learn like that, I think learn, as you just said, differently and more deliberately, and they're putting themselves more in it because they're bringing other jeopardies or rewards into the equation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, one of the things I found really interesting in your book that I read some of and want to come back to is the idea of defeating procrastination. And that would apply to another chapter you talked about, which is how to take a test, that there's skills to be learned and developed to take tests to prove your abilities. So how do those relate to one another? How do we defeat procrastination, which is something I'm always struggling with.
Yeah.
And I suspect we are all always struggling with.
Yeah, I mean, the procrastination is one of those things that the way psychologists have sized it up, it ends up sounding pretty much the way you and I would think about it, which is it's a choice. And so you've got something that's more pleasant. There's always, when you're procrastinating, it's always because you're choosing to do something else and you're choosing to put off something that you don't want to do. And so strategies,
which causes more anxiety, which you talk about later in your book about how to cope with anxiety, but so much of it is self-created.
It really is, and it's a short-term fix. You feel better in the moment, and you know quite well that it's gonna make things worse. So ultimately what you want to do is, if you tend to procrastinate on the same things, and because I'm talking mostly to students, I'm thinking about schoolwork, the ultimate strategy is to make work a habit. When something is habitual, by definition, it's not a choice. You just find yourself doing it. You don't think every night, like, should I brush my teeth? Should I put it off for a while? Well, you just find yourself brushing your teeth, right? As part of your routine. And so that's ultimately what you want to do. Actually made, you'll find this funny, Jim. As part of sort of trying to support the book, I went on TikTok. And I started making TikTok videos. And the TikTok video that I made about this strategy, about trying to make work habitual, actually went viral and has over 2 million views.
Kidding.
Yeah.
Hot stuff, Mr. TikTok star.
Improbable TikTok. Yeah, I don't dance, so it's safe to watch my videos. You won't have to see that. But this is something that people are really trying to figure out. How do I get myself really going and get myself to work? So ultimately what you want to do is make work a habit. Students tend to think of their schoolwork task by task. So they think, okay, what do I have to do? Am I reading today, or do I have a quiz to study for? And that's a decision. And instead what they should be doing is every night from 8 to 10 or whatever it is, that's work time, and you tie it to other things that are habitual. So like every night I have supper, then I help clean the dishes, and then it's work time. Mm-hmm. And just like other things that you do that are very routine, that's going to take the choice element out of it. So then there are other things you want to do to sort of get over the hump. Initially, it is going to feel very much like a choice, and procrastination is still going to be tempting. So there are things you can do to try and make that habitual, that mostly center around making that choice a little bit easier to make.
Well, what the fact that you became a TikTok star here makes all the sense in the world. When you look at how you lay out everything here in Outsmart Your Brain, and the way you structure it in the chapters, from studying for exams, judge exam readiness, taking tests, practice tests, learn from past exams, indicates how you learn, how the teacher wants you to learn, how the teacher usually lays it out. There's so much work you can do to prepare yourself to be a better learner. And what I think, what I most enjoyed about getting through parts of the book that I have is that the underlying theory that I've had, you're reinforcing, is maybe not a myth, which is we all should strive to be lifelong learners. That resume is not a noun; it really should be thought of as a verb.
Nice. So I like that very much. I've not heard that. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And the other thing I would add to that is, expect it to be challenging. Anybody who tells you like, we're going to make learning fun, it's not going to be fun in the way like, you're having a party and everything. It's satisfying. It feels good in that way. You feel, yes, there is satisfaction in doing something that is going to be a little bit challenging. But then afterwards, you get that sense of achievement.
So that goes to the behavioral side of our lives and setting expectations for yourself that this isn't going to be necessarily fun, but there are going to be psychological, emotional, and chemical rewards for achievement, for accomplishment, for learning, for putting a check mark in the box. And I love what you're talking about, because the hot book in the last year or two has been Atomic Habits. And you're saying structuring your world, that you do things like brushing your teeth on a regular basis, is the best way to avoid procrastination and to build in structure that helps you to feel good. It helps us to feel in control.
Absolutely. And the other thing there, towards the end of the book, there is a chapter on your image of yourself as a learner. And in that chapter, I really wrote that to sort of reach out to people who maybe don't have very fond memories of school and develop this self-image of themselves as someone who's not a very successful learner, and really wanted to get people to interrogate that a little bit and think about it. Like, is that really true? Because I think in most cases it's not. Everybody can be a learner for sure. And so if you have a negative self-image as a learner, that is going to affect you. The main thing it's going to affect is whether or not you're willing to take on new learning tasks, and also how you're going to interpret setbacks. And there's actually lots of research on this. If people who think of themselves as, I was never really very good at school, I was never much of a learner, when they have any sort of a setback, they take that as evidence that they're right. And this maybe was a message they internalized from their parents or they heard from their teachers. But you really shouldn't take it that seriously. You shouldn't think about it that way, because everybody can learn. It may take some people a little longer and some a little shorter, but everybody can get there.
I can understand why your TikTok video is such a success, because you could easily do that for each of the chapters in your book. Each of them is compartmentalized to give you a little something special to learn about yourselves and teach yourself to be a better learner, and how to genuinely outsmart your brain. And I look forward to seeing those bites. I hope we got to touch on some important topics for our community here today. I so enjoyed our conversation. I always enjoy our conversations. You've been a part of the Flowers Connectivity Council for a few years. You've helped so many. I learned so much from you. Every time we get to interact, I value it. I get to digest your book here, as I will more this weekend. Dr. Dan, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom with us. Thanks for all that you do in the classroom. I can't imagine why anyone would want to re-enroll in school just to go to the University of Virginia and sit in on your classes. What a gift that is for your students.
Thank you so much, Jim. It's always such a pleasure to talk to you. And as you said, we became friends during COVID. And one of these days, now that we can or
maybe on one of your trips to Canada to visit relatives, we can get you to stop off at the Big Apple.
Yeah, we've got to get together and hang out for sure. Thank you so much. It was for having me on to chat. It was really great fun.
Thanks, Dan.
Go to 1-800-Flowers.com. Find the perfect gift.
And wow the people you love.
Wow. This is amazing. Whether you want to say happy birthday. So cute.
Or I love you.
I love you too. Thinking of you.
Wow.
Go to 1-800-Flowers.com. Celebrate the people you love.
Well, I hope you enjoyed what you heard, and I know I'll be sharing it forward. I hope you get to as well.
let's keep the conversation going. Follow me along on Twitter at Jim1800Flowers and on LinkedIn at Jim McCann. Hope to talk to you soon.